All right, in that case, I call us to order. Would you please rise and salute the flag?
Allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, in compliance with NJSA 10:4, the Open Public Meetings Act, and in accord with DCA guidelines regarding the functioning of virtual meetings, this regularly scheduled meeting of the Jackson Township Board of Adjustment has been published and posted in all appropriate locations.
Thank you, Mr. Gertner. Can I have roll call, please?
Oh, can't hear her.
Danielle, are you there?
She's muted.
Muted.
Sorry, I muted myself. Mr. Costanzo,
Here.
Ms. Fritsch? Mr. Hurley,
Here.
Ms. McElhenney,
Here.
Ms. Camello,
Here.
Mr. Najarian,
Here.
Mr. Book.
Here. Thank you. Do we have any resolutions this evening, Danielle?
I do not have any, no.
Do we have any minutes?
The regular and executive session minutes from January 6, 2021 and January 20th, 2021, regular minutes.
Thank you. Can I have a motion to approve the minutes?
I'll make that motion.
Roll call, please.
Mr. Costanzo,
Yes.
Ms. Fritsch,
Yes.
Mr. Hurley,
Yes.
Ms. McElhenney,
Yes.
Ms. Camello,
Yes.
Mr. Najarian,
Yes.
Mr. Book.
Yes. Thank you. All right, that brings us to vouchers. I have two vouchers here. One for Francesca DeBella, who is now King Reporting, and we congratulate her on her new endeavor, in the amount of $250, and Danielle Sinowitz in the amount of $150. Can I have a motion to approve and pay both vouchers?
So moved.
I'll second.
Roll call, please.
Mr. Costanzo,
Yes.
Ms. Fritsch,
Yes.
Mr. Hurley,
Yes.
Ms. McElhenney,
Yes.
Ms. Camello,
Yes.
Mr. Najarian,
Yes.
Mr. Book.
Yes, thank you. All right, moving through the calendar, I come down to announcements, and I think this is an appropriate spot for Mr. Gertner to address two items on the agenda this evening.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, thank you. Good evening again to the members of the board, members of the public. Regarding application number 2, Strategic Equity Solutions, requesting a time extension for site plan number 773-1, and application number 3, WSNP, use variance number 3316. The board, through the board secretary, received a request to adjourn these and carry these matters based upon an illness of the applicant's attorney. We came to learn, however, that the applicant's attorney had in fact appeared, let me back up for a second. The option to appear virtually was given to the applicant and the applicant's attorney. They did not want to do that. We came to learn that the applicant's attorney did in fact appear on an application virtually in Lakewood Township yesterday. So I followed up with that particular attorney who indicated to me, first of all, I can make a representation that he certainly sounded ill. And as an officer, I'm speaking now, not only representing the board, but quite frankly, as an officer of the court, I am very comfortable in making that representation to the board and the public. You can certainly understand my concern, though, given the trouble we've been having in putting together calendars, that if if someone appeared just yesterday, why not today? And the applicant's attorney represented to me something that resonated with me as a fellow member of the bar, and quite frankly, as someone who believes overall, try to do unto others as you would have them do unto you. to the extent possible. We're lucky that we don't have the administrative office of the courts pushing our calendar necessarily. For those attorneys, you understand what that means. But at the same time, we still have to worry about moving applications. But when the gentleman says to me, listen, I've been sick, which we do know is true, I just have not had the application we had yesterday was something I had pre-prepped and was able to address, but I just have not had the opportunity to properly prep my client and be prepared the way I ought to be. That resonates with me. It really needs to respectfully resonate with the board as well. We have an equal responsibility to applicants, members of the public, and to yourselves, quite frankly. And if an attorney makes a representation, particularly in a circumstance where, and I verified this with Mr. Papuro, that these applications have not been, adjourned a number of times already, we have that obligation to accept the officer of the court at his or her, happens to be a his in this particular case, his or her word. So I have no issue in indicating that, the adjournment really benefits the board, quite frankly, because it buys into an issue that you don't need to address. But I did want to make, the board aware that the adjournment is beyond just simply being ill. It's really also, we have an obligation for that attorney's client to adjourn the matter so that the applicant is properly represented as well. And that's, as a quasi judicial body, I believe we have that request. So with that, unless there's an objection, which I'm hopeful there isn't, I believe we've already worked out, Mr. Chairman, members of the board, that the March 17 meeting would be available for both. Okay. We've also verified that these two matters were properly for this meeting. So I just need, so long as, and I'm not seeing any objection from any individual member of the board. So with that-
Just a question. Is there a time deadline here that we're in jeopardy of? I
He's-
noticed this application started back in October.
So he's waived time
He has,
based on
okay.
that 100%. In other words, the attorney's done everything he's supposed to do.
Good.
In order to do that. And I feel it's, as I indicated, an equal obligation to the applicant. With that said, Mr. Chairman, if I make two separate announcements. Mr. Chairman, members of the board, ladies and gentlemen of the public, regarding application number 2, Strategic Equity Solutions LLC requesting a 2-year time extension for site plan number 773. This matter will be carried to the March 17, 2021 meeting without the need of further notice by the applicant. The public is directed to the municipal website and the municipal newspapers for information regarding a login. It will also be carried through on the board's agenda. And Mr. Chairman, regarding application number 3, WSNP LLC, use variance 3316. That application too shall be carried without the need of the applicant making further notice. That the public is directed to the municipal website and municipal newspapers for place of publication for the Zoom webinar information for participation.
Thank you, Mr. Gertner. And I would like to thank you on making those necessary further inquiries to paint the full picture, because without the picture being painted in full, there may have been a couple of bland spots there that may have led to questions and concerns that would not have been substantiated. So again, I appreciate you finding out all of those details. And I think it's most appropriate that those adjournments go forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
All right, nothing further, Mr. Gertner?
No,
No other
sir.
announcements? In that case, then move down to our professionals. Would our professionals kindly introduce themselves and then be sworn?
We usually do it first, the swearing. So
Go ahead.
little change. Each of you have raised your right hand. To each of you individually, swear or affirm that the testimony, information, questions, and comments that you are about to present before the board shall represent the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Yes.
See, I would have believed you even if you didn't get sworn first. I'm sorry, go ahead. Introduce yourselves to the, please, thank you.
Evan Hill, Board Engineer.
Ernie Peters, Board Planner.
Frank Miskovich, Board Traffic Engineer.
Jeffrey Paporo, zoning officer.
Thank you, gentlemen. That brings us to application number 1, I report and Alan Cohen. Mr. Pape, the floor is yours, sir. Good evening.
Good evening, Mr. Chair, members of the board, board professionals. My name is Kenneth Pape, and I have the continuing opportunity and responsibility to represent the applicant before this board, I report and Alan Cohen. This is a request for preliminary site plan approval for mixed-use development. This application has a history with the board. Use variance relief was granted last year. We were granted it was granted in January of 2020 after a December 2019 hearing. And we presented the application to this board initially, the site plan application initially at the November 4th meeting, and we were here at the beginning of January. The second meeting, beginning of January, we were able to present to the board the complete testimony of the design engineer, Michael Antilli from Crest Engineering. Michael Antilli's testimony was completed. The chair and board will recall that the professionals examined Mr. Antilli, the board examined Mr. Antilli, and there was an opportunity for the public. That was concluded, and it was acknowledged that his testimony was complete and the examination was complete. The board also was very gracious in staying a little bit late that evening and allowing the second witness, Scott Kennel, our traffic expert, to complete his testimony. And similarly, the examination of Mr. Kennel by the board's professionals, the board and the public was concluded. Mr. Antilli is here with me this evening for moral support. I did not ask Mr. Antilli to return because his portion of the hearing had concluded. I did not have to ask Mr. Kennel to return because his portion was concluded. The third and final witness to present to the board is our architect, Mr. Tokarski. Mr. Tokarski is going to present to you the architectural features of the apartment buildings, the architectural features and floor plan of the clubhouse, and then to discuss with you the architecture of the commercial buildings. And at this point, because some of what we're doing requires, I think, a little summary of explanation, I'd like to do so at this time. As we began our meeting with you in January, I identified a number of areas that we respectfully asked the board allow us to carry forward and address to conclusion at a final site plan, this being a preliminary site plan solely. I indicated to you that Ira Port and Alan Cohen are medical practitioners and not in the business of construction and development, and they'd be looking for partners or purchasers to develop this project. And after site plan, a preliminary site plan, we have the confidence to go to the marketplace with the project. One issue I asked that we be allowed to postpone was the phasing. And I talked, as indicated, we acknowledged we have an obligation to tie commercial and residential development together with a phasing plan. And the phasing plan ultimately will be as you approve. I asked that we be allowed to postpone it for the simple reason that the market conditions that exist now, and particularly COVID-19 influence on commercial, makes it very difficult for us to give you an honest, well thought out phasing plan. We anticipate that the time between preliminary and final is somewhere 9-12 months because we're going to go get all the other approvals before we return, and the marketplace will change. At the time of final, we have a comfort level that we can make a meaningful commitment on phasing for your consideration. Similarly, we talked about affordable housing, and we acknowledge that we have an obligation to provide affordable housing. We incurred that obligation when this board was granted use variance relief. We acknowledge that it's 20%. It was explained to us that 20% was the number. 20% is the commitment. We indicated that we are building 1 and 2 bedroom apartments. Potentially, affordable housing requirements could include 3-bedroom apartments. We indicated a willingness to include 3-bedroom apartments if UHAC required. Your counselor stated that it's important that we remain flexible so that what we are offering to this board and to the Township of Jackson will qualify as affordable housing. Ultimately, we'll stay with the 1 and 2 bedrooms as we committed to initially, if that works, and we'll go to 3 if you direct us to do so, only for those that are affordable 3 bedrooms. We also made a commitment that we would continue to work on the sanitary sewer, that we have the continuing obligation. Mr. Antilli shared with you all the progress that he has made and the status of those approvals. We restate that commitment to you, that we continue to work on those. And we shared with you our meetings with the county. And we talked about the county having the final input as to what nature of crossing improvements will be required. We agreed that we would postpone that final decision. We asked that you postpone that final decision to final, and that we would continue to work with them. This evening, as we present the architecture, there's one more condition that we're going to ask you to consider. There are a number of buildings that are proposed as part of the commercial element. We envision that such uses as daycare, such uses as a restaurant, perhaps specialty retail buildings will express an interest. We are not in the marketplace. We don't have your site plan approval. We didn't go to the marketplace. People have come to us. We anticipate that the buildings will come before this board with full architecture on a building by building basis. I would expect, if we were fortunate enough to have a bank want one of the buildings, we would come in with the bank's architecture. If we were fortunate enough to have a daycare center, similarly, we would come in with their architecture. And I envision that each of the buildings that we show you are placeholders on the plan. Those are the maximum size and those are the locations of those. But we envision that we'll come in building by building as we have buyers and or tenants. I asked that Mr. Tokarski be prepared to demonstrate the type of architecture that we envision on these buildings. And from his portfolio of buildings that he is either familiar with or designed, he has brought a small assemblage of those just to give the board a sample. But our request would be, we'll show you the architecture for the apartments and ask that for your blessing on that. We will show you the architecture for the clubhouse and its floor plan and ask for your blessing on that. And as far as the retail, we'll make a commitment to a very high-end, coordinated, harmonious collection of buildings, but we would like to present them to you on a building-by-building basis as we secure end users. Sorry for the lengthy overstatement.
Yeah, so do I. Mr. Pape, no, I appreciate that very much. But forgive me, I don't understand exactly what you have in mind in regards to the phasing. Could you just elaborate a little bit more how that works in real time?
Sure.
And what you expect to occur?
Sure. Mr. Chair, it will work the way this board tells us it's to work, but I envision that we will ask for permission to build a certain number of units, building permits to be issued and COs to be issued before there's a trigger to have under construction a commercial building, and that we will work out a rolling program where a certain number of residential units can be under construction before we have to begin the construction of a certain square footage of commercial, and that we have to have, before we have a certain number of COs of residential, we'll have to have a certain square footage of COs for commercial. Knowing that we're being asked to make a commitment as to how much commercial, and being cautious, how about being afraid of COVID-19's influence on the retail market? I'm afraid to put something in front of you that turns out to be something that's not realistic. But when we step away from these immediate programs, we have every expectation that there will be winners and losers in the retail world. There will be users that you never see again, and there'll be users that just thrive. And we'll know who they are, and we'll start working on getting commitments from them and making commitments to you. I hope that was responsive,
That was-
Mr. Chair.
No, that helped me. Thank you. Mr. Gardner, anything further?
So, two questions, Mr. Chairman. One, to follow up on Chairman's point or question. The articulation that you just placed on the record, the representation, is that at all different than what was approved at the use variance?
No, Mr. Gertner, at the time of use variance, it stated the applicant shall agree to a phasing plan with commercial and residential to the satisfaction of the board. I think it was paragraph 23.
And the reason that's one of those rhetorical questions, just as you know, to place on the record. And the point was to make sure it's on the record. And secondly, so we hear the applicant's preference of having some part of residential before commercial. I'm fairly certain, though I don't have the transcript in front of me, but this will come as no surprise to Mr. Pape nor his clients, that the municipality's been burned by that. So that first phase may have to be a trigger of both. I don't want you to be surprised walking into that. But to further articulate that point, the memorialization, I think, was that broad because everyone kind of understood that, the marketplace is always changing. And instead of asking for specific amendments to something, the use variance language that was articulated was sufficient. We had hoped to have that at preliminary, really, and what Mr. Pape is asking for, primarily based on COVID, if I'm not hearing it.
It's COVID and the
incorrectly,
market conditions. That's it, solely.
is to kind of even push that off a little bit further to come with the proposal, because it'd be difficult to tie any commercial in right now with COVID situation.
Mr. Gooder, just out of curiosity, and I don't mean to digress too much, but you said that the township has been burned by that in the past. Would you elaborate a little bit more on what you meant by that phrase?
Well, sir, it's my understanding, at least, that past applications have not been as specific as to phasing and timing in general and that in order to do our best, and Mr. Peters probably can, I'm mumbling through it. He knows the answer better than me.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, if I
Peters?
might,
Go ahead. Yes, Mr.
there's a concern in the real estate marketplace that there aren't normally a single individual developer who builds residential and commercial. And given that the marketplace may not accept as much commercial or retail as it would residential, there's a need to tie them together, lest we end up with a project where all the residential is built and there's no trigger to get the retail that was part of the use variance argument for granting the use variance to allow the residential at the density and type asked for by the applicant. We should be obligated to make the two act in concert. How that happens, as Mr. Pape has indicated, is really dependent upon the market. From the town's perspective, we're told we're going to get 192 residential units and so much retail or commercial space. We need to make sure they're tied together. If not, we run the risk of the applicant or a successor in title who may not be as thorough or as practical as Mr. Pape and his client walk in and say, I have an approval to build the residential. That's what I want to build right now. I'll come back and build the other part when the market will handle it. And the town doesn't have any enforcement as it relates to that. So because we granted a use variance and because they're here for preliminary approval, I think it's incumbent upon the board to place something in the record that talks about the need for phasing of the two types of improvements prior to the start of construction on either portion of the project.
And we'll accelerate that and we'll agree that we will offer a phasing plan. We will hopefully earn your approval of that phasing plan, and that phasing plan would be memorialized in the final site plan approval. So it's in place before anyone's heading to the construction office.
Thank you, Mr. Peters. That was enlightening, and thank you, Mr. Pape.
And Mr. Chairman, just a second question, which is really a projection to the architect. This was also broadly discussed during the use variance application. It's been part of the idea of the fact that Jackson Township has no town center. In fact, where we sit today is as close to it as there may be. Historically, that was a goal, and I'm talking historically like 50 years ago, not necessarily, the master plan talks about it a little bit. So I think the architect, you broad brushed it as well. And the only reason I'm maybe making more of it than the board even is concerned, to be fair, is you talked about the fact broadly that the architecture will tie everything in, but then you also said, rightly so, a bank generally has their own architecture. The daycare centers do as well. So I would recommend to the board, though, that since this site is nearly across from Switlick and near this particular building itself, that the architect and architecture talk about what type of controls the applicant would be accepting of, to make sure that even if one of these commercial tenants want to come in with their own architecture, that there are some levels of control to bring it and tie it in together. Because it is at some level a town center. I think that's important.
I would like to respond. As I'm standing here and looking at a whole bunch of attorneys on the other side of the dais, lawyers can't testify.
Well, that's why I said I want the architect to know that that's a concern. He
But
needs to testify.
I can make the following proffer. The architecture that's presented to the board on the townhouses, the apartments, is the same architecture that we committed to at the use variance. We were pleased with it then, appears the board was, and we're going to restate it. And that architecture, those plans, we commit to the board. That's the architecture, unless this board allows a change. But what we'll show you, and for the clubhouse, exactly the same. For the commercial buildings, I would say that we could find words together. The buildings shall be similar, shall be harmonious. The buildings shall be, that they can express, the building architecture can express the needs of the individual tenants, but in a manner where there's consistency. You can be consistent with a roof line, you can be consistent with a mansard, you can be consistent with a color of brick, but we will make that commitment, and the final determination on the building by building will be as this board directs. But I would be comfortable having all that harmony language built in.
So that's a good proffer, if I may just follow up on that, though. So I agree 1,000%. It's for your architect to articulate this. The board has to also be cognizant that there are few, if any, architectural controls in the municipal ordinance here. Needless to say, however, because the particular applicant is before you in a use variance, you have the right to impose some of those reasonable controls. I'm stressing this because in certain places, probably our own knowledge individually knows that, there are certain brands that have architecture brands too, where if they really want, if that place really wants to go into that site, they say you're not going to have X or Y, and they do make that compromise. So since I too only went to an architecture school, but my degree is not in architecture. It's in urban planning, and I'm not a licensed planner either here. It's for your architect to give the board those words that ensures that as this region, and I'm talking about from Cedar Swamp Road to Leesville, let's say, as this region grows, that I know your applicant, listen, the way in which you presented this, I don't want anyone to think I'm opinion any other way. You're presenting things, you're honest, you're straightforward about what your vision is, but I think it's important for the architect to articulate that in your language to make sure that nothing, is completely out of what you're trying to design.
Very pleased that my architect is Mr. Tokarski because I know he's up to it.
So,
All right.
and I hope I didn't overstep.
With permission, we'll have Mr. Tokarski sworn, share his credentials with you, and then go right to his presentation.
Thank you, Mr. Pape.
That's your name.
And he's already okay because he's wearing a little blue and orange, so that's good color. You should raise your right hand. Do you solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony, information, questions, or comments you're about to present before the board shall represent the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? Can you kindly give us your full name, spell your last, give us your affiliation, and then the chairman will voir dire you about your credentials. And make sure.
That would help. My name's Richard P. Tokarski Jr., spelled Tokarski. I'm with the firm of Tokarski Millman Architects, Wall, New Jersey.
Would you just give us the benefit of your education and experience in this particular expert area?
Sure. I'm a 1992 graduate of the New Jersey Institute of Technology. I'm a licensed architect in New Jersey, New York, and formerly in North Carolina, although that's on hold. I've provided testimony before this board and numerous boards throughout the state for the last 20 years.
You are qualified, sir. Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Tokarski, I'm going to ask if you could present the architectural, the facade treatments of the apartments. Again, restate the strong, high-quality elements that were incorporated into the architecture. And when you conclude with that, if we could do the same thing for the clubhouse. And after that, let's go inside the clubhouse and go through all of the amenities.
Sure. As you can see by the rendering up on the screen currently, the apartments are designed in a traditional style.
So, Mr. Pape, do you have an idea of the marking? Was it pre-marked or?
This was pre-marked. This is part of the materials that were given
Did you
to,
pre-mark them? Because if you just sent the materials, they wouldn't be.
oh, just sent the material. No,
Oh,
We could classify this as A8, if you'd like.
A8 with today's date.
Okay. The rendering up on the screen is a portion of the front elevations, which is typical of both units, the 16 and the 8 units. It's a 2-story building in a traditional style. What we've done is we've created varying roof lines. As far as material goes, we've did a combination of clapboard style siding along with shingles and also board and batten to give some visual interest and break up the monotony of a facade. We've also created lower roof lines over the front entry. We've also adorned the windows openings with trim and shutters, and there's bracketry and decorative vents on the facade, as well as decorative columns. We also have stone along the base of the building. So we've created a rich palette to provide a aesthetically pleasing facade to both building types.
The clapboard, I understand, but enlighten me on board and batten. What is board and batten?
Board and batten is if you look where Mr. Pape is going up, it's on the left triangular gable. It's rendered white in this surface. It's a traditional material where you have vertical boards, and over the seams you place smaller raised battens. And it just gives some articulation and texture and an opportunity for color change on the front facade.
Thank you.
and this is the architectural plans for the apartments that was presented to the board. And the commitments that are made by the applicant tonight are identical to the commitments that were made when the board considered the use variance.
That's correct. We're looking for high quality materials with low maintenance.
This is the applicant's commitment. These plans are the applicant's commitment for the architectural treatment of the apartment buildings. And with permission, we'll go to the clubhouse architectural treatment.
Through the
Yes, if you-
chair,
Yes.
Steve Costanzo here. Just a question, the rear elevation, how would that, you have anything?
We do have rear elevations. If we go to Exhibit A2. If you look on the top of the screen, that's an elevation of the rear of the building. So again, the clapboard style siding wraps the building. On the back of each unit, there's porches and decks to create some private personal space for each tenant. Those would, also have vinyl railings for safety.
Did you bring the water table around?
Yes.
So the stone water table that's on the front of the building follows around on the other three sides.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Chair,
Yes.
Scott and Jerry, you had mentioned about the word stone. What stone were you talking about?
Typically in this type of construction, you would use a thin veneer stone, commonly referred to as a cultured stone, although that's a brand. So it's usually a manufactured type stone that's a thin veneer application.
Is it decorative stone?
Yes.
Yeah, it's not structural. Is that, it's not a structural stone.
No, it's a decoratively applied to the facade.
Okay, thank you.
May we go to the next
Yes,
building?
please.
Thank you. If you could
Okay.
introduce the
Yes.
clubhouse from the outside in.
If we could go to the file that begins with A-6. So this is the clubhouse, which is the common facilities for the apartment complex. It also houses the rental office. If you look at the front facade down in the lower right corner, we're using the same palette of materials that we're using on the apartments. Although the lower half of it is clad in the stone veneer, a little bit more than just the base, which creates a rich front entrance to a public building. We have decorative columns. We added some standing seam metal roofing as an accent over the entry to just kind of enrich the entry. And then we also utilizing the board and batten siding in the upper gable. And this also has a clear story cupola on the roof, kind of just to draw attention to itself as a place of gathering, and that also dumps light into the front entry foyer. On the upper left corner, you see the floor plan. This building will have a welcome center, has a rental office, some seating groups, a little kitchenette, a multi-purpose room on the right-hand side where you have pool tables, ping pong for common gatherings once COVID's all over and we can get back together with people again. On the left-hand side, we have a gym facility where they would have exercise equipment. And then centrally located, we have a men's and a women's bathroom, which would service this facility and also the adjacent pool and outdoor recreation area.
Through the chair?
Yes, Mr. Costanzo.
Mr. Costanzo, Steve Costanzo speaking. What the plan projected approximate square footage of this clubhouse?
Let's see. The proposed clubhouse is 3,250 square feet.
And again, you just indicated potential kitchenette. There's no formal commercial cooking.
No,
or
not a commercial
facilities?
kitchen, just, a sink and a place to make, plug a coffee maker in.
Thank you.
You may proceed, sir.
Thank you. Do you have any further on this building?
We can go to the next slide, A7, which would also show the other remaining 3 elevations. So there on this exhibit, you see the right and left elevations. Also on the lower bottom of the screen, you'll see the rear exterior elevations, which would face the pool.
And so that the record is complete, the batten board, the standing seam roof, the stone water table, the treatments, the window treatments, and the door treatments follow on all sides of the building.
Correct.
I think that we could take just a moment, You have a nice design of the sign that's proposed at the front of the center. Are you prepared
Yes,
to identify, show that sign? to the
sure.
board?
If you could click on exhibit with the file name A-5. So these are the various pylon signs which were proposed, which will be at the entrances of the driveways into each location. And they're broken up into, different tenant spaces that would service each of those commercial buildings.
Could you identify the construction materials that are proposed?
Most likely it would be a polycarbonate, internally illuminated, kind of more of like a box sign. We also have some materials and naming of the center kind of vertically on the left-hand side of each sign. So it would be an internally lit sign with each tenant's own it would be polycarbonate, internally illuminated box sign.
Mr. Chair,
Perhaps it's too soon on the signs, but I am curious. Would they be illuminated with fluorescent or LEDs?
Almost everything today is done in
Is
LEDs.
all LEDs?
Yeah.
So LEDs, you may not want to do that because that would, Mr. Peters, that would trigger a variance, would it not? An LED sign? No?
No, he's talking about, the testimony was that these are backlit signs, not changeable copy signs. So the lighting, instead of being the old fluorescent bulbs, will be LED bulbs,
I'm
but
sorry.
inside the sign itself.
It's the changeable.
It's not changeable
No,
copy.
it's-
Yeah.
That's what triggers the variance. I apologize.
oh,
Yes, these would be fixed signs with polycarbonate and vinyl lettering.
Mr. Togarski, in your explanation of the aesthetic of the clubhouse and the structure there, there's a certain stone component and a certain feel and aesthetic from those buildings. Is there a reason why you're not carrying that out into the signs?
Basically, we left these kind of neutral as to, we don't have, the commercial buildings aren't designed yet. So we haven't, necessarily established a style, but we can talk about, that this evening. And then if the board so chooses, we could incorporate some of the materials from the apartments or the commercial buildings into the signage so that they're coordinated and complement each other.
Good, thank you. Mr. Hill? Oh, never mind, I'm sorry.
I had one more series of questions, and I think it's the heavy questions about that language about harmony that I wanted to put on Mr. Tokarski before his examination began. Would that be acceptable? Or is there,
Yeah, I think that's, Evan Hill, I think that's okay. I think you're providing at preliminary, you're asking for preliminary, you're providing a concept for the signage, but at this point, you're not asking for any variances for signage. These would be fully conforming to the ordinance.
we're not asking for any variances for the signage.
Okay,
We may,
okay.
and we don't know.
So any dimensions you have on here is subject to final site plan.
Yes, Mr. Hill.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for
Mr.
clarifying.
Chairman? Ernie Peters, Mr. Pape, I need to be a little more blunt about it. You have a copy of our report dated November 2nd of 2020, correct?
I do.
In there, we list a number of variances based upon the information that we've just testified to.
Yes. The testimony that was presented by Mr. Antilli was with regard to the actual site. With regard to the signage, we're not asking for, this evening, we're not asking for any variances for the signage. The final design of the signage
So
is,
an approval this evening does not include approval of the plan that's up there that requires a variance, correct?
the approval this evening, if approval is granted, would necessarily say that the applicant showed samples of signage to the board and made a commitment to add architectural features and to identify any variance relief that's needed at the time of final approval. Because we're not asking you for variances this evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Bates.
So here's where you have to earn your fee. Describe to this board in words that Mr. Gertner can properly memorialize in a resolution and gives this board comfort that we've made a real commitment. The types of materials, the types of methods that are available to take disparate buildings and bring them back into harmony.
Okay, if it's the board's pleasure to have a coordinated series of 4 commercial buildings that all relate to each other, we could put some language in there in terms of style of the particular buildings, or we could include certain materials, or that they have to relate to one another. The hesitancy to do such a thing is that there are national tenants that may or may not want to go into a space where they don't have control over the building. For example, a Chick-fil-A, their buildings and their brand are tied to the architecture, and they would probably turn down a site that may not be able to express their brand or architecture. So when you basically what you'd possibly be doing at this point would be creating spec commercial space that may appeal to a smaller or a certain type of tenant, where you may or may not want to attract a larger or national brand to the area. Sometimes those brands will make concessions and sometimes they won't. So I think it's a more of a discussion tonight of what are you looking for, and then also in the style of what you're looking for in this town center. If you're looking for more of a traditional style, we can talk to that and discuss some elements and materials that express that. There's also, I've noticed in, I'd say the last 5 to 8 years, a lot more of commercial architecture is leaning towards contemporary and modern. You're seeing that all over the place. And it's becoming mainstream, where before it wasn't. Everything was traditional. You're seeing a lot of modern design. And perhaps Jackson has a flavor, or a tendency towards more of a contemporary or a modern aesthetic. Or we can say, we want it to be traditional and match with the apartments and the clubhouse and have everything that way. But that would be a direction and an input that we'd look to the board for some guidance on.
Through the chair,
Mr. Costanzo, yes.
as per your previous statement, you're saying national chains may be turned off by any requirements, so to speak, speccing. So wouldn't even the concept of a contemporary exterior speak to that as well?
For the most part, I would say most of the national chains have a modern aesthetic that they're promoting at this point. You see a lot more of that, the McDonald's, the Wendy's, they're not the old traditional, branded style that they used to be. They're all modern architecture at this point.
We have had the opportunity over the years to do a large number of centers with multiple buildings. And even when you have the bank or the fast food restaurant or the drugstores or the daycare centers, all of which begin with their own architecture, it's been my experience that there's some level of flexibility in all. So if we made a commitment to you that we would be using a palette of natural tones, and the exception would be the red and in addition to the natural tones, the greens and tans, that would be permitted to use a red brick. That would probably be something that we could easily get most of the nationals to work with. If we made a commitment that the buildings would be a combination of facades, including stucco, brick, and more traditional, and no building would be a single material. And if we made a commitment to you that the buildings would not exceed 2 stories in appearance, and if we made a commitment to you that we would use roof lines that were compatible with one another and were compatible with a residential community. I think those are not handcuffs, but those are tools that give the board a sense that there'll be some control. There's not going to be something that's stainless steel with a bright blue stripe on it. It's some control over the buildings. And if we are so fortunate to get an extraordinary tenant, the likes of which no one wants to go away, we'll come in and we'll ask for variance relief. But I think we could make those commitments to you.
Thank you, Mr. Pape.
You're welcome.
Any other questions from the board? Nothing, Mr. Pape, anything further?
I have, we left with some questions that we promised to answer. And I wrote down the questions and the answers. You asked us if we would include bicycle parking at the pool and clubhouse area. And the answer is yes, it will be added to the plan and subject to your professional's review. You asked us, what would the hours of operation of the pool be? And I did inquiry and to find out when pools open and when pools close. And I learned that pools open generally between 9 and 10 a.m. The 9 a.m. is more often when there is young children opportunities. And pools close dusk or 7 p.m. So I would be very comfortable saying that we would put hours of use of the pool that would make the pool use compatible with the immediate apartments that said no earlier than 9 a.m. and no later than dusk or 7 p.m., whichever is the earlier. You also asked if we would have a parking lot assignment program. And this one was very interesting for all of us. We learned there are apartment complexes that enjoy no parking numbers. There are parking programs that enjoy partial numbering and partial unnumbered. And there are others that are strictly numbered and registered to the apartments. And it appears that the actual community finds the one that works best for them. So unless it's direction from this board that we must have a parking program, we would ask that the parking program and striping be left up to the management company of the apartments, unless you direct otherwise. We found, people told us, all three work depending on the community. In fact, since you brought this to my attention in East Brunswick, I just finished a project where we had agreed to have no numbered parking, and they all got together and voted that they wanted half of them numbered. And that was something that just happened. We just had to go back to the board to put the numbers in half of them.
Through the chair?
Yes, sir.
I'm sorry, could you just, if anywhere mentally, how many parking spots are we allowing? Are you projecting?
Oh my gosh.
Because my experience is you number parking lots because you're limited in spaces. So you're designating, you have to tell people where to park. But my testimony, my recall of your testimony, you had an overabundance of parking.
We had
You
first.
exceeded the requirements.
Mr. Costanza, first we met the standard, and then your staff said, meeting the standard by the law isn't the right standard. And we put another, I think, close to 50 units. And then we spread them out through the facility. So we're way over.
That was my understanding.
You got to come back or make the representation. Better way to do it. Off the record. Hang on, back on.
We added 26 parking spaces above RSIS requirements and on one side, 26 on one side, 25 on the other, with 51 up and over RSIS, no relief. So, and
Hang on.
Yeah. Mr. Chair? Yeah.
Yes, Mr.
Just to add on to that comment, Frank Miskovich, at the last meeting, I testified on the plan after Scott Kennel and Ms. Nantelli went through it. And I indicated that I looked at the allocation of parking around each residential building complex, and they do meet or slightly exceed the RSIS requirement at each building area. And that includes residents and visitor parking. So I was comfortable on that layout. I also tend to agree that it might be better left up to the management company because every location's different, different clientele and people. And since we have enough parking, circulation works, I think they're better off managing it themselves because then it's an enforcement issue if you try to do something different.
thank you. The last question.
Chair, through the chair. Are they also incorporating these management team that's going to come in, the lifeguards and security teams and people available to take care of issues that come up within the apartments?
There's
that
a
break
100,
down?
yes, there's a
So
100.
these are additional cars that are going to be coming into this facility,
Yes.
right? These individuals. Is that going to be compensated?
Not sure I follow, and individuals into the complex itself or over by the
Inside, the
pool?
maintenance team that's coming in to work on the property. Is there enough parking spaces for the
I know.
lifeguards?
Well,
The security team?
okay, yeah, around, as I went through the allocation, around the clubhouse and the pool area, I estimated there's probably about 30 spaces that would be available around the clubhouse if you exclude the parking requirement for the residences. The testimony was about 3,000 square feet, I believe, for the clubhouse. And if I use kind of a standard occupancy of 15 square feet per person, right, that's about 20 people, so thereabouts. And if you take one per car, I think the 28 spaces that we have should work. And obviously, we've indicated we've had bike paths and walking paths throughout the community. So hopefully, some of those people would be arriving, via bicycle or whatever.
May I follow up, just working a long time now with Mr. Najarian? May I ask it a different way? I'll ask, I guess, our expert. Do you feel it necessary to designate employee parking? Or to hold on to the closest spaces around the community for members of the community first and have the employees walk a little bit further? I mean, I'm asking those questions out loud. Is that kind of?
Exactly what I was trying to get to, but you brought it to it.
Specifically that question, I don't see that as a problem, designating some spaces, employee parking. I think we just have to work out where they would be. Obviously, we'd like to locate them in a location that's not quite accessible to all the buildings, kind of more remote. But I don't have a specific location at this
So,
point.
Mr. Miskovich, would you have an issue? Again, that would be an issue that they would have to present at final.
That's correct. I would wait till we look at
That would
final.
be-
We can kind of look into that further once we have ideas on how many employers there might be.
Okay. And then we're talking about the disabled spots. So did they incorporate the disabled spots in each location?
They have around the clubhouse, they're illustrating 2 handicap spaces, which would meet the requirement or slightly exceed it for the number of parking spaces around there. We can take a closer look since there might be extra, whether we need more. But I think we can take a closer look at the handicap parking at final. And we have some room to adjust. I guess that's the answer.
Thank you. Good, thank you, Mr. Davis.
I have one last question that you asked of us. I think we may have answered it, but I want to make certain that we did. And that was around the stormwater basins, would we add fencing? And I think there was a suggestion by, I think it was Evan Hill, that an appropriate fence is the 4-foot-high fence with the wire mesh. I was taught that fence is typically high enough to keep a youngster from wandering in and not too high if a parent has to jump over it. So we're very comfortable adding around the stormwater basins a 4-foot post and rail fence with the wire mesh affixed to it. And Mr. Chair, those were the questions that I memorialized from the January hearing. And that was the testimony that we left unspoken when we were here in January. That concludes the applicant's direct presentation to the board in support of the request for preliminary site plan approval. Mr. Tokarski and Mr. Antilli are here if there are any further questions of them.
Thank you, Mr. Page.
Thank you.
Board members, any additional questions of Mr. Togarski or the applicant's attorney? Seeing none, professionals, are there any additional questions or follow-ups?
No.
Good. All right. Well, in that case, I'm going to open it to the public. All right, Anthony, okay, wait a minute. All right, the screen blinked on me, Anthony. Anthony, do you have anybody on your screen from the public that is interested in being heard? Is anybody out there? And so if I'm understanding the computer, because I'm looking at now at it for the first time, you've been nice enough to give me a computer. I see Tony's out there, which is us, Daniel, and Tony and Camello, and then just the Jackson Township host, right? Am I seeing the right stuff? This is on-the-job training,
Look at
guys.
attendees, yeah.
What do we do?
So There's one hand.
Okay. So we have Jeff. Thank you, Anthony. And so there's a Jeff that wants to be heard, Anthony, is that correct? All right. Jeff, are you out there?
He has to let him in.
He's gonna let him in. All right, I'm jumping the gun here.
All right, so Anthony, if you could remove the exhibit from the screen so we can see the gentleman. Please.
Jeff, are you there?
Yes, I'm here.
All right, we can hear you. We're just working on seeing you.
Okay, there I am.
Okay, sir.
It would not be for this one.
Hang on, sir, hang on. If you'd raise your right hand, do you solemnly swear or affirm that the information, questions, or comments you're about to present before the board represent the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
Yes.
Can you kindly give us your full name, spell your last, and your address, please?
Jeffrey T. Marvin, address 4227 73rd Terrace East, Sarasota, Florida, 34243.
Okay, we missed, I think, your last name. Can you spell it, please?
Marvin, M-A-R-V as in Victor, I-N.
Marvin.
Can you read the address again, too? I'm sorry, we had a little problem here.
Okay, 4227 73rd Terrace East, Sarasota, Florida, 34243.
Okay, Mr. Marvin, do you have any specific question or comment on the application?
Not this specific application. I just raised my hand just to be acknowledged because when you will be talking about the property at 146 South New Prospect, then I have some questions. Thank you.
So, did you hear that right?
Yeah, I did. So, Mr. Marvin, you may not have been tuned in at the time. That application, which is application number 3 on our agenda, was carried to the March 17, 2021 meeting due to the applicant's attorney's illness.
Okay, I'm sorry. Thank you.
No problem. We appreciate you doing what you did.
Would it be possible then to get some notification from the township board of joining the Zoom webinar with the appropriate meeting code and the...
So that information will be, I'm sorry, Mr. Marvin, I apologize.
Okay, go ahead.
That information will be present on the municipal website and also published in the appropriate newspapers. It'll also be on the agenda for the March 17 meeting when that agenda is actually published. Mr. Purpura, do you know about when normally that information becomes public? Roughly?
Ideally, it should be made public at least 5 days before the meeting.
Oh dear. Okay. Thank you. What I will do then is I will contact the attorney for the applicant and make sure that they contact me with appropriate time, so I'll be able to manage my schedule to be able to join the meeting. Thank you very much for your attention. I'm saying good night now. Thank you.
All right. Okay. Anthony, I'm seeing other names on the list, but I'm not seeing anybody that wants to be heard. Do you agree? All right. Well, in that case, then I'm going to close the public portion of the meeting. And thank you. Mr. Pape, any
Very
closing remarks?
briefly, very briefly, from the examination by the board and the board's witnesses, it is crystal clear that you have followed carefully that which we presented to you. This is a request for preliminary site plan approval. As your professionals indicated at the January meeting, after considerable exchange between our professionals and yours, we've come up with a plan that we were proud to present and I believe was well received by your professionals. we would ask that the board consider granting preliminary site plan approval with all of the commitments that have been made on the record. And the applicant will then go back to work on the outside approvals before returning to this board to seek final approval. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Pape. All right, board members, it's ours. Any discussions?
Mr. Gertner, excuse me.
Yep.
I'm going to need guidance on how we're going to separate the difference between the 192 homes being built and the commercial buildings. How we're going to put them together to be properly presented.
Well, that actually is part of the request for preliminary. So I'm going to, before I articulate, I think that is better, again, to be repeated by the applicant who made a proposal for the board.
We acknowledge that we acknowledge that there's both a retail element and a residential element. We will ask that a certain number of residential units be permitted before there is a trigger for retail to be required. It can be done in the form of building permits tied to building permits or building permits tied to certificates of occupancy. We will place before you a plan that we believe is one that is reasonable and economically feasible. Your attorney has indicated that we should not be surprised if the board were to say there needs to be an immediate connection between residential and commercial. I won't be surprised. I will, but we'll work with you to come up with a plan that is economically viable.
So thank you, Mr. Pape. So with the board, if that's a question, the board should deliberate. The applicant, and if you disagree with me, please put it on, articulate it. So the applicant's request globally is because of COVID and other economic factors, they're not ready to present a phasing plan that they feel would be sufficient for the board or themselves to vote upon. So what the applicant has asked is to carry that question, the details of that question, to final. The applicant further asked, though, in the broad rubric, right, that they be permitted to, that any plan that they present, that they be permitted to present a plan that has a trigger for the commercial only after some number to be determined of residential units are constructed. I indicated as the board's attorney, I made a representation that the applicant ought not be surprised if during deliberation, the board concludes that putting that final decision off is in all likelihood not an issue. The board is certainly sensitive to the current economic situation, but the applicant should not be surprised that any phasing plan that they're ultimately required to present for final approval include a residential and commercial component, to use the vernacular, right out of the box. And that's really, that's a discussion that needs to be had amongst, with the board. Is that a fair summary?
Yes, I'd like to add, I'm not here to argue the case. I'm not ready to. I don't know what the future will bring, but there's a 14,000 square foot retail center on the property. We'll point that out that there is a retail building on the property. That'll be something we ask that the board take into consideration. When we file our bonds to build one side, and this project has two separate sides, there will be the infrastructure will be, you don't put infrastructure partially. You start at the back, you do the stormwater, and you do all the utilities. So you're going to see a very, very significant commitment from the applicant, let's say on the 112 side, and just by way of example, these are not numbers but let's say we said, can we have 30 COs before we have to build 10,000 square feet of new retail?
For fear that I'm assisting to make your case, I know your applicants are here. Can one or the other, you made a representation about the current commercial building. Making a suggestion to further inform the board through the chair. Can one or the other just come up and testify if they know the current vacancy rate of that 14,000 square foot? And if you don't want to answer that, that's fine.
Dr. Port proudly stated it's 100% rented. Dr. Port proudly shares with you his building is their building is 100% rented right now.
It is 100% right. Okay. So, and I've just been reminded too, as well, that this is really a site, remember, this is preliminary site plan approval, and they did make a representation at the use variance stage that they would be coordinated, which is kind of where the recommendation came from.
I mean, there's
All
all
right,
kinds
I
of
think,
economics.
don't overworry. I think
Okay,
the-
thank
the
you.
situation.
Thank you.
All right. I'm going to beat a dead horse as to this coordination, just so I can make certain I have it squared away in my own mind. I understand the concept of the business complexity and making a decision as to when to go through and when to commit to the commercial. I understand the concept of a trigger and what that trigger would be. But as I understand it, that's not a decision that you need from us tonight.
No.
That's going to be a decision that we're going to make when you come back on final, where tonight we're dealing with a preliminary site plan approval.
Mr. Chairman, that's correct. And that is our request. We owe you that answer, and we have to earn your approval, just not tonight.
Just wanted to
No,
get it squared away in my mind.
clarity is so valuable. 2 years and 5 years from now, it's so valuable.
Any further comments or questions? Mr. Hurley.
Just one comment. Just to make things simple, and I agree with what the chair just mentioned. It makes more sense to me to have a phasing plan associated with the final approval. Because a number of things are in effect here. Number one is going to be COVID, so we don't know what the market pressures are for the commercial uses. The applicant has to go out and try to get at least non-binding financing commitments once it gets its preliminary approval. At least it can get started in that regard. It doesn't know who the tenants are going to be in the commercial aspects. Someone mentioned Chick-fil-A before. If anyone has been to Chick-fil-A recently, you can't get in there. I mean, it's just jammed. And you need a specific type of parking arrangement and drive aisles, and they do it on a temporary basis. We won't know that until and hopefully COVID kind of disappears. So it makes more sense to me from a practical point of view to just even hold all of those issues, because they may have to come back with the aesthetic aspects of the commercial buildings, so they don't know who the commercial tenants are going to be. I know from experience that a lot of these big commercial tenants have their own buildings, period. And they're designed and you can't change them at all. So it has to be that or they go someplace else. So it makes more sense to me just to have it all done on final approval. I have no problems with preliminary site plan approval. They come back with final, all conditions imposed have been satisfied. At that time, we can discuss a more realistic phasing schedule.
Thank you.
Mr. Hill?
I know you're in your deliberation at this point, but I just, if the applicant's attorney can clarify that with this preliminary approval, it is not your intention to do any tree clearing, site preparation, or off-site improvements until final site plan approval is perfected.
No. We don't, the old-fashioned preliminary site plan, I'm going to go in there before I post the bonds and start doing, no.
Okay,
No,
so,
yeah.
okay, thank you for that
Sure,
clarification.
Sure, no.
Board members, any further questions or comments? We good? Do I have a motion? Second?
Well, I just want to clarify, so we're melding here, mind melding. So we're considering in the preliminary, the fact that we're going to agree that the commercial and residential should be phased in unilateral together?
No. What,
To be decided.
to be, exactly.
Well,
When they come back for a final, if I understand this correctly, that's when they are going to present to us how they wish to phase this.
oh, I see. Okay, good. So that is, all right, that, it is what I heard. Okay, very good. All right. But that was my concern as well. Okay. With that, yeah,
Wait, hang on one second, because I just noticed, we're not quite talking across each other. And I'm not, but I think sitting here as a professional representing the board, and Mr. Peters and I happen to represent both boards, I do feel respectfully that the board should articulate. I understand pushing the final determination to the final approval, but the board previously made and it was part of the use variance approval, that these would be residential and commercial would be tied together. And you don't want the applicant to take from your approval and understanding that you're willing to look at a final phasing plan at final approval, that you do or do not have a preference that phase one include both a residential and commercial component. And the reason I keep coming down to that at least 30,000 foot articulation is Mr. Peters did a better job than I talking about our knowledge of certain items that have occurred in the past where the residential components have been built far more than anyone ever expected, and there's still then no commercial piece. And it's not, and in order to assist the applicant, their argument is marketing, right? Let me just break it down a little, right? In my opinion, but it's for the board's deliberation. If their argument is marketing, they have a better opportunity in understanding about how to market the thing if they know going in that there has to be a residential and commercial component in phase one. If you just say it's all out, in my opinion, if you say, well, it's left open until final, period, without some level of direction, they'll come back and they'll say, well, we'll put two buildings up with 10% of the residential or whatever that number is before we come back to a commercial. And I'm not, first of all, that's not what their representation was at use variance. And secondly, I'm not so certain respectfully that's really is your intent. Now, maybe it is.
Well, they can't put a shovel, Jim Hurley, by the way. They can't put a shovel in the ground until they get final approval. So why can't we, on final approval, make the condition as to what the phasing schedule will be like, and without them getting that, they don't have approval at all. They still have to wait for us to make that decision. It's contingent, their approvals are all contingent upon us making a decision at final as to what the scheduling will be. We'll have a better idea of what the market is like then.
My only respectful advice is I think that is good articulation for deliberation. I'll just add another sentence to that and say, however, there remains a board preference that phase one include a residential and commercial component together.
All right, let me just, I got to stop there for a second, because I'm getting, what I'm hearing is, if I'm hearing you correctly, Mr. Gertner, is that by virtue of the use variance that we granted, there's some explicit or perhaps an implicit understanding that commercial and residential have to both start at the same time, and then the frequency of how much of one is going to occur over the other is then becomes the phase, or not, or is it, or can the phase be they still are committed to do a residential and a commercial component, but if they're here at final, and it turns out based upon the information they give us that we want to provide a phase for them that allows them to build commercial first or build residential first, and then at some at some milestone, then they have to commit to going with additional commercial or additional residential.
So,
I'm having difficulty
well-
with the starting point.
Can I
What
read the
has to be
language you
done.
used the last time, Sean? Because it was good language. I mean, this is what you placed in the record. And when someone is building residential apartments, you want to be able to say, stop, you didn't give me commercial. Freeze. That's the practical. And the language that Mr. Gertner used was, the second issue was to make certain that there would be a fair balance between the construction of residential and commercial uses. The board being fearful that the applicants, though well-intended, could end up building only the residential component. And then there was another issue before that. On both of these issues, the applicants indicated that during site plan testimony, should the use be approved, the applicants would offer a plan both related to construction disruption and to ensuring that residential and commercial development of the site would be balanced. So there's tools that you have that says no more COs, no more building permits. There's benchmarks where you say, we're going to do the entire site improvements on one side because we have to, but you can only build the first 2 buildings. And then after that, you have to do these things commercial. And if you don't do that, the faucet's turned off, no more building permits.
so.
That's how it works.
All right, I can't help myself. So that was nice general language for the use variance because the board was truly concerned. And Mr. Pape acknowledges that the hope, in fairness to the applicant too, because no one knew about COVID and stuff, right? The hope was that phasing plan would be here. He's asked, in my opinion, I can certainly stand with that, to the board to say, kind of defer that level of detail until final because of the circumstances we find ourselves in, among other things. My recommendation is still maybe not 30,000 foot, but 20,000 feet, that given that concern is articulated during the use variance. My respectful opinion, and I think at least Mr. Peters as well, that, and I used it before, I'll use it again. The township's been burned with even having 2 buildings. I'm sorry to pick on his analogy, 2 buildings, and then what happened? Then you have a 2-building unit and still no residential, still no commercial other than there. That my recommendation to the board is to sit here tonight. It's still not stone, but if the board believes that the concern still exists, that when they come back for final approval, that they should still be guided by a board's preference. And I believe the board's preference was always be that phase 1 include a residential and commercial component.
At the same time.
At the same.
There
time.
it is.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's why I brought up the
And that's what
question.
the use variance was based on. So we approved that based on that. And I don't think it's any surprise to the applicant that we are going to ask for that. I think we'll be willing to work with you on it, but at some point, yes, it's going to be required, right? I mean, that's how I feel. That's what we approved.
Right. That's why I brought up the question.
Not trying to change anything, making a firm commitment that has empirical data in it, this many this and this many that. Tonight, I don't have the tools to make a good statement.
So that's why I can, and I'm looking for input from our professionals, but I certainly could live with language similar to something substantially similar to the board repeated its preference that during the first phase of development, both a residential and commercial component move simultaneously, or something to that effect. Still a preference, they can still come in and say it doesn't work, but it's still your direction that way.
So I would,
But that's up to the board.
Evan Hill, and I would recommend to the board that you recognize that there's a condition within the use variance resolution that the applicant has agreed to continue to abide by, but wants to finalize the specifics of that phasing plan at time of final site plan. Nothing that I've heard from the applicant is inconsistent with what's already been approved by this board. So the applicant's just asking to finalize those details at time of final. If there are, if based on the testimony, there are additional elements of that prior condition you want to add to, then so be it. That's your discretion. But I think at this point, I haven't heard anything the applicant, or that's inconsistent with what's already been approved and what the applicant has testified to.
I have one, it's important for me to say, I don't like to argue with the board. We have come before you and your board's professionals with the goal of creating a viable project that's a credit to the municipality. If we put too many conditions on it, and we could make a mistake putting an early condition on it, if we put too many conditions on it, we could create something that's not economically viable. I'd ask that we acknowledge that we had this discussion, we acknowledge that there is a responsibility, but I would really ask that the final determination be made when we come back with final approval, and we will have a whole lot more knowledge. We will have, at that point, either a partner, a buyer, or a joint venture, and someone who's in the marketplace. We will have been allowed, because site plan has been granted, to go out to the public and say we have site plan approval and solicit interest, and we can come back and give you some pretty good answers. So I just would ask, please don't inadvertently put something in the resolution that when we look back at it a year later, we say, that's going to be a problem. I do not want to be taking anything back. I don't want to be contradicting myself or saying, I wish we hadn't done that.
Mr. Peters and Mr. Gardner, here's my question for you. Are you suggesting to the board that if we do not tonight require that their final present a phase plan that requires a simultaneous construction of both commercial and residential, if we don't do that, then we're in violation of the use variance that we granted them? Is that to see that? Good.
No.
So then I'm back to the concept previously discussed, that we do a phase plan, and they represent the phase plan at final. If they come in at the final and they come in and they say, well, you know what, here's what we'd like to do. We'd like to start to build these residential units, and we're going to build 100 for just the sake of it, 100, before we break ground to build a commercial. And if we allow that phase plan, are we then in violation of our use variance? No. So
But
go ahead.
there's no hook between preliminary and final to ensure the simultaneous development of the residential and commercial, which is why, and then, I'll be educated, but which is why I'm careful in my words, that I would prefer that if it's a preference, that you articulate that preference as a condition, as the condition of preliminary. Because if you don't, and they come back and they say, well, we want a 30% residential before you do commercial, and you deny them, deny final because you don't agree with that, what's the basis of that denial at that point? Because they kicked it off, at least you
All right,
got.
so you want to set a standard. You want to set the standard by using the word preference. I'm just trying to wrap my head around what you're looking to do.
Maybe Mr. Peters can
Mr.
either
Peters,
agree or disagree or add further.
I can't agree to a standard.
Well,
I
you don't have
any
to
tools
agree. It's now deliberation.
Can you repeat that?
My suggestion, my recollection, though I don't have the transcript in front of me, was that as was articulated at use variance, right? Was that the board was always concerned that residential would my language today, outstrip the commercial development.
But we can modify the use variance tonight. We can
Well, I don't know
modify
if no, you can't because
This is a site plan application.
Yep,
Huh?
This is a site plan application.
Well, yeah, but
they didn't notice for that.
that's not the point. The point is that what we're talking about here is a condition of the use variance, a phasing plan. Was that a condition of the resolution?
Yes, I believe it was.
Well, what does it say?
It was not in the conditions, it was in the preamble.
So whatever action, we took that may have carried it to site plan approval, we are at site plan approval. We can make the modifications necessary administratively in that regard, it doesn't require notice. It's a decision of the board that we would be modifying. Secondly, you know, what my concern here is that if you do a requirement for simultaneous construction of commercial and residential, and there's no commercial market, you're going to end up with vacant buildings, which is not the greatest thing to have, along with residential dwellings. I think that what we can do as an alternative is say, look, at final, we need a phasing plan. The phasing plan will include at least this. Commercial doesn't start until you get COs for one building or something of that nature. At least get them started. I think that's part of the recommendation that was made by the applicant in any event. So at least they can, it's not, you know, if these were residential dwellings that they were selling and they needed the money to put into the pot so they can start the commercial, that's not the case here. They're going to rent these units. So they're going out looking for financing for everything here. And it's all coming from whoever is giving them the money so that they can get started. So I don't see any problem with saying that the understanding will be when you come in with the plan, it has to at least have this. You can't get certificates of occupancy from more than one building until you get the construction permits for the commercial building, or restart it, however you want to say it.
And this is Evan Hill for the board. Also, just remember that they may be back a year from now, they may be back 2 years from now. The commercial market may be outpacing the residential market at that point. And they're going to want to build all the commercial space and maybe defer the retail or the residential. So I think it's premature. I think you're covered with language in the use variance. I do believe at this stage, it's premature to add anything additional to that because it has the potential for an adverse effect either way.
Mr. Peters?
Mr. Chairman, our concern's protecting the town. The applicant came in for a use variance that had both residential and non-residential. Part of the testimony, to the best of my recollection, I apologize, I haven't been able to find in the 4 or 5 transcripts the actual testimony, was that they needed more roofs to sustain more commercial and retail. And so to the extent the board may have relied upon that to give the number of residential units in the use variance approval, my concern is that in the past, the town has allowed for this type of development and to date has nothing but apartments. Go up by Glory's, the Mitch Lee property. We have 500 apartments, no retail or commercial. The 2 multifamily projects for Lee are ready to get approvals and start, and there's not a site plan application for a retail component of that large GDP. So I don't doubt the sincerity of the applicant, their attorney, or their professionals. But there's nothing on the record that says they can't sell the project tomorrow morning to someone else who walks in and says, I'm building residential because you didn't say I couldn't. That's all. I'm not trying to create a project that they can't market. I'm trying to protect the town. If the applicant wanted to build all residential, they should have come in for a use variance and said all residential. They came in with a combined project that said residential and non-residential.
So then what is your suggestion in terms of how you marry it then? How do you marry them together and still give the applicant the flexibility that he needs?
If I had that answer, I'd make
So
Mr. Pape's rates.
So I don't get his rates either, but that's why I kind of agree with my suggestion, which is just articulate your continued preference.
How would you feel about, Jim Hurley speaking, how would you feel about relative to the benefit of the township? And I don't want to give the applicant a heart attack here, but if he's going to build the residential, the first residential has to be the affordable housing before any commercial is built.
That does not work.
They're rental.
That doesn't work because they're going to be interspersed.
Why wouldn't it work?
Because he
They're
wants,
interspersed, Judge.
we wanted them the board wanted them interdispersed and not have.
Well, I know that, but my only question here is, if we're going to put a condition relative to commercial, that before he can, I shouldn't say it, in order to build a commercial, we're going to limit the COs to only the building that contains the affordable housing units.
So there's
That
affordable
gives a
housing.
benefit, excuse me,
Oh, I'm sorry.
that gives me the benefit for the township in any event relative to the affordable housing element. It does give some encouragement, some pressure to the developer to build a commercial, which is what we want to do. And it gets them a shovel in the ground.
Board members, there's a couple of ideas floating around. You've heard a couple put on a record by Mr. Hurley, a couple potential solutions. There's another that we use the word preference, given, I think we're inclined to give the applicant the minor site plan approval, but articulate a preference that when he comes back for the phasing, that we are going to look for something that is going to be like a simultaneous commercial and residential commit, or perhaps if
Allergies.
God bless you.
Thank you.
If if our minds are kind of burning out here and we want to take a look, see at the transcripts and come back another day after having digested them, maybe revisit this. Those are kind of the things that are floating around, unless board members have some other ideas as to how.
The preference approach seems acceptable because it's non-committal and it allows us to at least go forward and give them an opportunity to get their financing and make the decision at final.
Yeah, I like that idea as well, Mr. Hurley.
And it still keeps the tone
It still
that we're
keeps us
conveying.
protected if we, yeah, absolutely.
All right. With that, if there's nothing further, does anybody have a motion and a second on this?
Jim should
Incorporating that
Jim
language?
should articulate that motion.
I'll make a motion. That we grant preliminary site plan approval upon conditions that have been stated, which I guess Mr. Gertner has, along with the condition that on final approval, that the preference of the board will be for the phasing plan that there will be some concurrent construction with residential and commercial.
I know this is deliberations and I have no speaking part, but I made a mistake earlier. I neglected to point out that the minor subdivision, the minor subdivision is also part of the application. I apologize.
I didn't hear either.
That the minor, that the motion includes the approval of the minor subdivision, which they need to start running some of their
Yes.
sewer and stuff.
Yeah, for clarity's sake, in the application, they're seeking preliminary major site plan and minor subdivision approval for a mixed-use development of rental apartments and commercial buildings where previous variance approval per resolution 2019-47.
My understanding with
Thank you.
minor, with subdivision approval, though, it gives the applicant the right to do some work.
No.
But in this case, they've articulated that we cut.
So
whether-
that'll be a condition.
Yes, correct.
Okay.
It's just to separate the back of the property from the front of the property. There's a restaurant in front. He wants to keep that. We're buying the back. And we're just going to annex it to our property so we have the ability to bring sewer when it's time to build sewer. But no development at all.
Mr. Hurley's made a motion with that clarification and with the preference language incorporated therein. Do we have a second?
I'll second that.
All right. Roll call, please.
Mr. Costanzo?
Yes.
Ms. Fritsch?
Yes.
Mr. Hurley?
Yes.
Ms. McElhenney?
Yes.
Ms. Camello?
Yes.
Mr. Najarian?
Yes.
Mr. Book?
Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, all board members and professionals, to each and every one of you. Thank you for your careful deliberations. Good night.
Thank you, Mr. Pape. Do I have a motion to adjourn?
Motion.
All in favor?
Aye.
We are adjourned. Thank you, everybody.